The cold morning air clung to the valley like a ghost, thick and pale, muffling every distant sound of war. The ground was soaked in frost, and the smell of smoke drifted from the burned-out village beyond the hill. Somewhere between the silence and the echo of retreating footsteps, 6 German nurses moved through the woods, their white uniforms smudged with dirt, their hands trembling around a stretcher that no longer carried a man but only the last traces of him, his blood, his bandages, and the scent of death. They had been walking for hours, unsure if they were following the right path or only wandering deeper into enemy lines. The youngest among them, Elise, barely 20, pressed her coat tighter and whispered, "If they find us, will they shoot?" No one answered. The oldest, Greta, whose gray-streaked hair poked out from her cap, kept her eyes fixed on the frozen trail ahead. She had served in field hospitals near Normandy before everything collapsed, before orders turned to chaos and officers vanished into the fog. They had lost their ambulance when a shell tore through the road 2 nights earlier. Since then, they had been walking, guided by rumors of a surrender line, a camp, perhaps American-held, where nurses were being taken alive. The wind cut through the trees, and Elise stumbled on a root, almost falling. Greta caught her arm, steadying her. "We keep moving," Greta said quietly, "until we see the flag." But the flag they found wasn't theirs. By noon, the forest thinned, and the women stepped out into a wide clearing. Smoke rose from a cluster of vehicles on the far side, green trucks, tents, and men in helmets they didn't recognize. American soldiers. For a moment, none of them breathed. Elisa's lips parted, and her heart began to hammer so hard she thought the men across the field could hear it. One of the soldiers turned, spotted the white coats, and shouted. Others lifted their rifles, spreading out. Greta lifted both her hands, her voice calm but heavy. "We are nurses," she called in broken English, "not soldiers." The Americans advanced cautiously. Boots crunched over frost, barrels pointed but not firing. A tall sergeant stopped in front of them, his face rough, eyes tired but not cruel. "You speak English?" he asked. Greta nodded slightly. "Enough to beg for mercy." The sergeant's jaw twitched. He studied the women, their torn uniforms, the empty stretcher, the bandages stained brown. "Where's your unit?" "Gone," Greta said, her voice breaking for the first time. "All gone." The man lowered his rifle a little. "You're lucky we found you before the storm hits," he muttered, gesturing to his men. "Take them to the camp." The nurses were herded toward a truck. Elise glanced around as they walked. The American camp buzzed with noise, engines humming, men laughing, someone playing a harmonica near a fire. It didn't look like the enemy camp she had imagined all her life. Inside the truck, the wooden floor was cold and smelled of oil. As the engine started, Elise clutched the side panel and stared through the gaps at the passing trees. The forest faded behind them, replaced by open fields and burned barns, by roads littered with twisted metal and silence. Greta sat opposite her, head bowed. She looked exhausted, but her eyes stayed open, watching, as if afraid the world might vanish if she blinked. After an hour, the truck stopped. They arrived at a makeshift camp ringed with wire fences and guarded by men who didn't seem hostile, just wary. The nurses were led inside a wooden hut that smelled of coffee and mud. A young American lieutenant with papers spread before him looked up when they entered. "These the nurses from the forest?" he asked the sergeant. "Yes, sir." 6 of them. Unarmed. The lieutenant studied their faces one by one, then said something none of them expected. "You'll be treated as non-combatants. You'll have food, beds, and medical supplies. You'll help at the infirmary, we've got our own wounded." Greta blinked. "We work for you." "You work to stay busy," the lieutenant replied. "War's over for you." The words hit like sunlight through fog. War's over. Elise felt her throat tighten, tears stinging her eyes before she could stop them. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of the next sound she'd hear. That night, the women slept in cots with real blankets. Outside, rain began to fall softly, tapping against the tin roof. The sound was almost kind. Elise lay awake, staring at the dim light bulb swaying above. She thought of her brother, lost near Stalingrad. Of the propaganda posters that had told her the enemy was savage, heartless, monstrous. Yet the man who had given her soup that evening had smiled when she said thank you. Maybe Mercy didn't wear a uniform. Morning came with the smell of coffee and bread, real bread, not the stale gray loaves they had eaten in the field. The nurses lined up in silence, each given a tray by an American cook who grinned and said something she couldn't understand but sounded kind. Elise sat at a wooden table, staring at the food. Bacon, eggs, potatoes. Her hands trembled as she picked up the fork. Greta watched her. Eat, she said softly. You'll need your strength. Elise took a bite. The warmth flooded her mouth, salty and rich, like nothing she'd tasted in years. Tears rolled down her cheeks before she realized she was crying. A soldier walking past paused, confused, and asked, "You okay, ma'am?" She nodded, smiling through the tears. "Yes," she whispered. "It's just, different." The camp soon found work for them. They changed bandages, sterilized instruments, comforted wounded Americans who stared at them with suspicion at first but slowly softened. One soldier, barely older than Elise, had a shrapnel wound in his leg. He flinched when she approached, then murmured, "Didn't think a German would be the one patching me up." Elise smiled faintly. "Didn't think I'd be here either." Greta became close with the American medic, a quiet man named Thomas who helped translate. He taught her how to use their equipment, cleaner and more advanced than what they'd had in the field hospitals. He spoke gently, and she found herself laughing once or twice, a strange, unfamiliar sound after years of silence. Days turned to weeks. The nurses began to feel something they hadn't felt since before the war, safety. They still wore their gray uniforms, but their faces changed. The hard lines of fear slowly faded, replaced by a quiet softness. And yet, in the back of Elisa's mind, a question lingered. Were they safe because the Americans were kind, or because the war had ended, and they were no longer seen as enemies? One night, as she sat outside the barrack watching the stars, a soldier came by and handed her a folded paper. Inside was a photograph, a group of American nurses smiling by a jeep. On the back, in shaky handwriting, it read, "You remind me of home." Elise pressed it to her chest, feeling something stir inside her that she hadn't dared feel since the bombs began to fall, hope. But hope, like all fragile things, doesn't stay untouched for long. The next morning, the camp received new orders. Trucks rolled in, carrying officers with sharp eyes and colder voices. Greta noticed it first, the change in tone, the tension. The war in Europe might have ended, but something else was beginning. And for the German nurses who thought they had found peace, the world was about to remind them that mercy has limits. The morning that followed carried a strange silence, a silence that felt heavier than the usual quiet hum of soldiers moving about. The air was cold again, thick with the smell of wet soil after last night's rain, and the sound of engines filled the distance as the new officers arrived. The nurses stood near the infirmary tent, their white armbands damp from the drizzle, watching trucks roll past with crates and metal boxes stamped with symbols they didn't recognize. Greta noticed how the soldiers' faces had changed overnight. The easy laughter that had filled the campfire area was gone. Now they moved with brisk, precise steps, their eyes scanning everything. She turned to Elise, who stood beside her, wringing her hands. "Something's wrong," Greta murmured. Elise nodded slowly. "Do you think they will send us away?" Before Greta could answer, an American lieutenant approached. It wasn't the same kind one who had first welcomed them. This one was older, clean-shaven, with sharp gray eyes that gave nothing away. He stopped in front of them, glanced at his clipboard, and said, "Orders from command. You'll be questioned, all of you." Routine. Greta understood only half the words, but she caught the tone. She exchanged a quick look with the others, fear, confusion, silent prayers, and followed when the officer motioned them toward a wooden hut near the fence. Inside, the smell of cigarettes hung in the air. 2 desks, 2 men. One wrote while the other asked questions through an interpreter. Greta sat first. They asked about her station, her duties, her commanding officers. Each answer she gave felt like stepping through a minefield. The interpreter's eyes were soft, but the officer's pen scratched coldly across the paper. When they called Elise, her hands trembled so much she nearly dropped her cap. She answered in broken English, explaining that she had been a field nurse near Cannes, that she had treated soldiers and civilians alike, that she never carried a weapon. The officer looked up at her finally. "Do you believe you were helping the right side?" Elise blinked, unsure how to respond. "I believed I was helping the wounded," she said quietly. For a moment, the officer's face softened, just slightly, before he nodded for her to leave. That night, the camp lights glowed faint through fog. Greta sat at her bunk, hands clasped, listening to the faint hum of the generator. The questioning had lasted hours. None of them knew what it meant. Would they be transferred? Released? Punished? Elise couldn't sleep. She got up quietly and stepped outside, wrapping her blanket around her shoulders. The air was sharp and cold. Somewhere near the wire fence, she saw a small group of American soldiers talking in low voices, one of them lighting a cigarette. Among them was Thomas, the medic who had helped her earlier that week. He noticed her and walked over, his boots crunching softly on gravel. "You should be asleep," he said gently. "I can't," she replied. "Everything feels different." Thomas sighed, looking out at the mist that hung over the field. "Those men who came today, they're from headquarters. They don't know what you've seen, what you've done here. They only see uniforms. Do they think we're dangerous?" He hesitated. "They think everyone's dangerous, until they're told otherwise." Elise looked down, her fingers gripping the edge of her blanket. "We only wanted to save lives," she whispered. Thomas nodded. "I know." They stood in silence for a while, the camp quiet except for the faint barking of dogs near the gate. Then Thomas reached into his coat pocket and handed her something, a small piece of chocolate wrapped in crinkled foil. Elise stared at it as if it were gold. "Eat it before it melts," he said, half smiling. "It helps." She smiled faintly, thanked him, and slipped it into her hand. It felt warm, almost forbidden. When she returned to her bunk, she shared small pieces with Greta and the others, 1 square each. For a few moments, the bitterness and sweetness together reminded them that they were still human. The next few days passed with strange calm. The nurses were allowed to keep working at the infirmary, but soldiers now watched them closely. The tone of kindness was still there, but behind it lingered something heavier, suspicion, bureaucracy, the slow machine of war grinding even after the guns had fallen silent. Elise noticed it in the way conversations stopped when they walked past, in how some men averted their eyes. But she also noticed something else, small gestures that broke through the walls. A soldier who slipped her an extra slice of bread, another who thanked Greta for helping his wounded friend. Tiny pieces of humanity, scattered between orders and fences. One afternoon, while cleaning surgical instruments, Elise found herself alone in the infirmary. A journal lay open on the table, Thomas's handwriting, quick and uneven. She hesitated, then glanced at the page. It wasn't official notes, it was a reflection, maybe something he wrote to remember. "The German nurses are better than we expected. They work hard, hardly speak, but when they smile, it changes the air in the room. Maybe we're not so different after all." She closed the book gently, her throat tightening. Later that evening, Thomas came by to check supplies. He noticed the journal's position and gave a small knowing smile. "You read it, didn't you?" Elise flushed. Only a little. That's fine, he said softly. I meant it. She looked at him, unsure what to say. Something in his tone was tender, cautious, as if he too was surprised by his own words. In the weeks that followed, the nurses became part of the rhythm of the camp. They learned English words through necessity: bandage, pain, heal, sleep. The soldiers learned bits of German in return. Laughter sometimes echoed between bedsides. The line between prisoner and helper began to blur. Greta, who had once been all discipline and silence, started humming while she worked. Elise found herself walking outside more, breathing the free air, watching planes cross the distant sky without the usual dread. But one evening in late spring, everything changed again. An officer arrived carrying new papers. He spoke with the lieutenant, voices low but urgent. Later, the lieutenant gathered the nurses together. His expression was stiff. "You'll be transferred," he said. Command decided to move all Axis personnel to a central holding facility. "You leave tomorrow." The words dropped like stones. Elise felt her stomach turn cold. "We cannot stay?" she asked quietly. The lieutenant shook his head. "Orders." That night, the nurses packed their small belongings. The camp seemed to breathe differently, the wind sharper, the stars more distant. Elise sat outside her barack one last time, the blanket around her shoulders, staring at the flickering lights of the camp that had somehow become a strange, fragile home. Thomas found her there again. "I just heard," he said, his voice low. She nodded, unable to look at him. "They are sending us away." He crouched beside her, his face half in shadow. "I tried to speak for you, for all of you. They said it's not up to me." Elise swallowed hard. "Where will they take us?" "To a camp in the south," he said. "Safe, they say." But, he didn't finish. The silence between them grew heavy, full of all the words that didn't need to be spoken. When he finally stood, he reached into his pocket again and handed her a folded note. "Don't open it now," he said. "When you're there. It's nothing important, just something to remember." Elise took it with trembling hands. At dawn, trucks lined up by the gate. The nurses climbed aboard, the engines rumbling like thunder beneath their feet. Elise looked out through the narrow opening at the men who had become familiar: cooks, guards, medics, all watching silently as the convoy prepared to leave. Thomas stood near the infirmary tent, his cap pulled low, hands in his pockets. Their eyes met for a brief, fleeting second. He gave a small nod, almost invisible, and she held his gaze until the truck turned and the camp disappeared behind dust and distance. The road stretched endlessly through fields of yellow grass and broken towns. The sky was pale blue, the kind of color that used to mean peace. Elise unfolded the note finally, her fingers shaking. It was short. "You reminded us that mercy still exists. If you ever see light after this war, remember that not everyone wanted to fight." Her eyes filled before she could stop them. The truck kept moving, carrying them toward an unknown place, away from the only safety they had known in years. But deep inside, under the fear and the ache of leaving, something quiet remained, a warmth, a truth she couldn't unlearn. Not every enemy is cruel. Not every war kills the heart. And for the first time since the guns began to roar, Elise realized she didn't hate the world anymore. The sun had barely risen when the sky over the ruins burned in hues of dull orange and gray, the smoke still drifting across the silent streets where buildings stood like broken teeth. Elias walked with his coat torn and his boots heavy with mud, carrying the faint hope that somewhere beyond the next street, there would be something alive, something human. His breath came in small clouds that vanished quickly, swallowed by the cold that had lingered since the night the bombs stopped. Every step echoed through the hollow town, and every sound reminded him that silence had won this war more than any army ever could. The letter in his pocket had grown soft from being unfolded and read too many times. He didn't know why he kept reading it because every word hurt, yet every word kept him walking. It was written in her neat hand, ink smudged at the edges as if touched by tears. If this ever reaches you, know that I waited, Elias. I waited until the last train left. I waited until the sky turned black and the ground trembled. If you come back and I am gone, remember me by the river. That's where I will be free. He had read that line until it became his only prayer. The river wasn't far. He could already hear its weak murmur through the wind. But before he reached it, the ground changed, ash mixed with shattered glass and the faint remains of burnt paper. There were signs of life once, a child's toy, a rusted bicycle, a cracked photograph frame with two faces smiling at nothing now. He picked it up and brushed off the dust, but the faces were already fading, eaten by the damp air. He placed it back gently and walked on. When he reached the riverbank, it was not the same river he remembered. The water was dark, reflecting the gray of the clouds, and the trees that once lined its edges were twisted and bare. Yet something in that stillness calmed him, as if the river still remembered what it was to carry the world's reflections before the smoke. He sat down by the edge, feeling the cold seep through his hands as he cupped the water, letting it drip through his fingers like memory itself. Then, for the first time in days, he closed his eyes. He saw her, not as the ghost that haunted his sleep, but as she had been the day before the war began. Her laughter had filled the small square near the bakery, her hands dusted with flour as she sold bread that smelled like peace. He remembered teasing her for giving extra to the children who couldn't pay, and she had said softly, "They'll remember kindness longer than hunger." That memory alone was enough to break him now. Because hunger had outlived kindness in this world, and laughter had become a stranger's voice. A branch snapped behind him. His eyes opened sharply. For a moment, his heart raced, expecting danger, but it was only a boy, thin, no older than 12, his face smeared with dirt and fear. He carried a metal can and looked ready to run if Elias moved too fast. Elias lifted his hands slowly, showing he meant no harm. "Water," the boy said quietly, his voice cracked. Elias nodded and pointed to the river. The boy hesitated, then stepped closer, kneeling to fill his can. When he looked up again, his eyes met Elias's, a strange mirror of what war had done to both young and old alike. "You're not from here," the boy said after a while. "No," Elias replied, his voice hoarse. "I'm looking for someone." The boy wiped his mouth and said, "You won't find many people left. They left when the fire came. Some crossed the hills, others went east. Did you see anyone by the river?" The boy thought for a moment. "A woman. Days ago. She left flowers in the water. She didn't say anything." Elias's breath caught. "Did she have a red scarf?" The boy nodded slowly. "Yes. She was crying." The world seemed to narrow to that single moment. The air turned thick, and Elias felt his knees weaken. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the letter again, and stared at it like a relic of something holy. "Thank you," he whispered, but the boy had already gone, running back through the trees. Elias remained there, the river murmuring softly, as if whispering her name beneath the ripples. He followed the river upstream, every step feeling heavier, yet his heart beating faster with something he hadn't felt in months, hope. The air grew quieter, and soon he saw a small cross of wood half buried in the mud, surrounded by wilted wildflowers. He knew before he touched it. The scarf lay beneath the cross, faded but unmistakably hers. He knelt down, his fingers trembling as he brushed the dirt away. The fabric was cold, damp, and heavy, but it still smelled faintly of her, of flower, of rain, of life before ruin. Elias stayed there until the light began to fade. The world around him seemed to dissolve into shades of gray, and the sound of the river became a heartbeat that wasn't his own. He whispered her name once, twice, then stopped because the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, as if the earth itself was listening. He took out the letter one last time and read it aloud, his voice breaking halfway through. Then, gently, he folded it and placed it beneath the cross, pressing it into the ground with his palm as if to anchor her soul. When he stood up, the wind shifted. The clouds moved, revealing a streak of gold light breaking through, painting the river in color for the first time since he had arrived. For a second, it almost felt like she was there beside him, not as a ghost, but as a warmth, a presence, a memory made real. He smiled, barely, and said, "You waited. So did I." He turned away from the river, knowing there was nothing left to find, only something to carry forward. He walked until the sound of the water faded behind him, until the road opened into a vast plain where the ruins ended and grass began to grow again. In the distance, smoke still rose from what had once been cities, but between them and him stretched something pure, untouched, waiting. He knew he would never rebuild what was lost, but he could still remember. And maybe that was enough. Days passed. He found others, scattered survivors, faces hollow but eyes still holding small flickers of belief. Together they built fires at night and told stories of before, of laughter and bread, of rivers and letters and the sound of music under open skies. And every night, when the fire dimmed, Elias would look toward the horizon and imagine her sitting by the river, waiting, watching the world begin again. Years later, when peace had slowly grown roots again, people would talk about the man who carried letters through ruins, who never spoke much but always smiled when it rained. They said he built a small house by a river, where he planted flowers each spring, red ones, always red. They said he kept a scarf folded near his window and that sometimes, when the wind blew just right, he would sit outside and whisper a name to the water, and for a moment, the world would feel whole again. The river kept flowing, unbroken, carrying petals and ashes alike, weaving the story of those who had lived and those who had loved through its eternal current. And in that endless motion, Elias found his peace. Not in victory, not in survival, but in remembering that even after the silence of war, something still spoke, the quiet hum of life finding its way through the ruins, the faint echo of laughter carried by the wind, and the heartbeat of a promise that had outlived the world. And when the final dawn came, with its light spreading over the valley and the river shining like glass, Elias walked down to the water one last time. He wore the same coat, now patched and faded, and in his hand, he held a single red flower. He bent down, placed it on the surface, and whispered, "I kept my promise." Then he smiled, the kind of smile that comes when pain finally turns into peace, and as the river carried the flower away, the sun rose higher, burning away the last shadows of yesterday. The world had changed, yes, but it was alive. And as long as it lived, so did she. So did he.